Okay. I'm Alex Wendt. I'm a professor here at the Mershon Center and also in political science. And before introducing our speaker, I want to talk about myself for a minute. When I was a grad student back in the 80s, my advisor, Bud Duvall, was a Marxist. Well, he still is a Marxist. And back then, Marxist state theory, Althusser, Poulantzas, all this stuff was all the rage. Marxist IPE was really big. And as students of Duvall, we were all deeply trained in this literature and in the debates. And then on the side of that literature, we were also trained in world systems theory, which was a big deal back then too. Wallerstein, Chase-Dunn, everybody else. And one of the first things we learned from Duvall was that world systems theory is not really a Marxist theory. Okay, it's sort of allied, maybe fellow travelers or whatever, but it's a separate tradition. It's not really Marxist. Okay, and we had to internalize that. And I understand the reasoning there, although I tend to think these are all sort of pretty close. But after grad school, but I do remember, though, thinking that this literature, even though it wasn't truly Marxist, was very dynamic literature, was very interesting literature, engaging lots of interesting problems, and so on. So after grad school, I moved on and lost touch with both Marxist IR and world systems theory. But apparently, the literature remained very dynamic because it has given us Jason Moore, who is an ecological Marxist. Is that a fair description?
No eco.
No eco. Okay. All right. Just a Marxist. Okay. Well, your kind of Marxist, as far as I know, didn't exist at all when I was in grad school in the 80s. So there's something new here that wasn't there before. So just a few words about Jason then. He's an associate professor of sociology at Binghamton University. He writes frequently on the history of capitalism in Europe, Latin America, and the U.S., both from the long 16th century all the way up to the contemporary period. His work has won a number of awards. His book, Capitalism and the Web of Life, was published with Verso in 2015, and he's presently completing Ecology and the Rise of Capitalism, an environmental history of the rise of capitalism for University of California Press. So I'm very much looking forward to this return to part of my roots and learning what I've been missing along the way. So please join me in welcoming Jason Moore to the Mershon Center.
Thanks. What a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon. I want to thank Alex for inviting me and Stephen for doing the yeoman's work of making it possible for me to come and doing all the logistics that is a kind of work we don't pay enough attention to or give enough acknowledgement to. So thanks. So what I want to talk about today is the politics of nature, the politics of work, the politics of capitalism, and how we can make sense of those in a historical perspective so that we can do something about it. And the great problem of much Marxist thinking is that it hasn't taken nature seriously. And the great problem of a lot of eco-thinking, ecological thinking, including that which goes under the banner of ecological Marxism, is that it hasn't taken work seriously. So we're going to try to put these into conversation in a historical way. And the history is what's really important here. We need to make sense of history. I love theory. I'm a conceptualizer. But all of this has to be at the center of a radically historicist approach to understanding how our world came to be and what to do about it. So, yes, we are in the midst of a profound planetary crisis, and here we have the great pictures of the great Neo-Malthusian pictures of tipping points of state shift, a rather dry term for a rather horrific process that is abrupt and irreversible changes in the web of life. We are in an era of what we are told is mass extinction. That, to me, is a bit of a euphemism. It seems to me that we are living in an era of mass extermination. So we have three big questions that the Earth system scientists, the Anthropocene analysts, that global environmental change scholars from across the discipline are wrestling with, but is really captured in this discourse around the Anthropocene, which of course translates literally to age of man. And guess who populates the ICS Commission on the Anthropocene, but a bunch of men. So when and where, and that matters actually for reasons that go beyond representation. When and where did this begin? We're asking, how did we get here, and who, in any event, is we? And so how we answer these questions shapes our diagnosis of the problem of so-called ecology and society, and indeed central to interrogating that diagnosis, this reality, is asking whether or not these categories of society with an uppercase S or humanity with an uppercase H is the appropriate counterpoint to nature with an uppercase N, or whether we are dealing with a much more complex, entangled, and messy reality. So this I give you not to identify the empirics. These are Anthropocene hockey stick charts that are everywhere these days, but to tell you the imaginary of ecological crisis. And the imaginary of ecological crisis says that the origins of crisis are the origins of modernity. They are found in England, in the countryside, with coal, and then moves to the cities with the satanic mills of great cities like Manchester, industrial cities there. I want to suggest that that is not false, but entirely partial, and that locating the origins of modernity and ecological crisis with the consequences of industrial capitalism will lead to a disastrous series of political strategies that doesn't adequately get to the underlying relations of power, of thought, of production and reproduction that go on under historical capitalism, a capitalism that did not begin in the 18th century. We'll get to when it did begin in just a moment. The underlying thought of this imaginary is what I call green arithmetic. And this goes for Anthropocene advocates. It goes for the Marxists like Bellamy Foster. It says, here is society, then we're going to add in environment. Here's capitalism, we're going to add environment. And that was very useful for a very long time. The scholars in the environmental studies in humanities and social sciences worked very hard against a lot of opposition in the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s to valorize this field of study. And green arithmetic was central to it. I want to suggest that society plus nature at a certain point does not add up. And we have reached the point where it doesn't add up because we understand that all of these processes, these socioeconomic trends on one side of the screen, are in fact irreducibly bundles of human and extra-human nature. They are materially and symbolically enacted. So we have two Anthropocenes shaping the global discourse today. One is the geological argument, and this is an argument around golden spikes, stratigraphic signals. What are the signals that have been settled upon? Well, chicken bones, nuclear residues, plastics. These are the great accomplishments of historical capitalism in the geological record. A few millimeters, if that will be left millions of years from now. But there's another one, and this is what I want to really problematize. It is the popular Anthropocene. And this is a debate over the origins and character and nature of ecological crisis, of the limits we face, and of what to do about it. I will simply foreground the popular Anthropocene and its mainstream incarnation, that is the incarnation blessed by the editorial board of the New York Times and all its wisdom, The Economist magazine, is a discourse that is profoundly anti-democratic and anti-political. So what's this thing, the capitalocene? What an ugly word. Capitalocene. People say, Jason, it's an ugly word. I say it's an ugly word for an ugly system. So the capitalocene, the age of capital, challenges the popular Anthropocene. It challenges it in several fundamental ways. One is that the language of anthropogenic is profoundly falsifying. It describes an actor without a history, so it's ahistorical, which is the core of Neo-Malthusian thought. Neo-Malthusian thought isn't fundamentally about population. It's about removing from history the questions of scarcity, of limits, of transformations in landscapes. The anthropogenic can't explain these historical changes. It can only look at the consequences of the hockey stick consequences. So capitalogenic rather than anthropogenic allows for a kind of historical specificity that is impossible under the language of the anthropogenic. But people say, well, it's not all about economics. Well, no kidding. It's not all about economics. Capitalism is not fundamentally all about the market. In the words of the great French historian Fernand Braudel, capitalism is the system of the anti-market. So we need to put together the questions of the accumulation of power, of the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature as an organic and evolving whole, not as Venn diagram circles in which you see the common areas in the midst. No, it's much messier, it's much more interpenetrated, it's much more entangled than our diagrams allow us to do. And the way that I and others have taken to talking about this is as a world ecology. Capitalism is a world ecology, not the ecology of the world, but a world ecology, a way of organizing capital, power, and nature in which each moment is unthinkable through the others. That all movements of capital, all movements of power, and those domains of the web of life, which are always highly partial, taken up by capitalism, explored, and that capitalism seeks to subordinate, that these are moments of an evolving whole. So when Alex introduced world systems analysis, the great insight or the great contribution of Wallerstein, almost universally unrecognized, is the application of Marx's philosophy of internal relations to world history, something that has rarely been taken up since, and indeed probably most of you know world systems analysis as a kind of positivist or structuralist exercise, an approach with which I emphatically disagree. We need a relational approach, and we need a relational approach that doesn't devolve into particularity. We need to understand that local particularity and world historical patterns are parts of self-forming and self-organizing wholes. So we have this narrative of the popular Anthropocene and the origins of crisis that begins in England around 1800 with coal and steam. But this is problematic. If we want to understand the modern relations of capital, nature, and power that gave rise to the so-called Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is so important to deconstruct because it's really the lodestar not only of economic thought, not economic history of social theory, but also, of course, of green thought. So let's begin. The 1492 isn't past, it's not even over. The origins of the modern world are found in the long 16th century, beginning in the decade that Columbus is born, in the 1450s. This was partly a Columbian project, the raping, the killing, the slaving. This, of course, is still fundamental to capitalism today, albeit in different forms. But it was also the emergence of European rationality, which I don't take as particularly rational, but the European rationality with the uppercase R, including its cost-profit calculus and its view of nature as external, space as flat, time as linear. Modes of production are always modes of thought, and there's no neat and tidy way to predict how those two moments interact. This includes, of course, the invention of what Donna Haraway calls the God trick. One could now look at the world as if one were standing outside of it, and we'll return to this, that cartography and cartographic and geographical imaginations matter, and they matter in a way that I think geographers have underemphasized. We'll get to that later. So we're going to do two things here. First, we're going to invert green thought. We're going to pick on the Marxists in a minute. First, we're going to pick on green thought. Green thought's central problematic can be summed up in a phrase. What does capitalism do to nature? This is the kind of questioning that gives us the ecological footprint and other powerful metaphors of environmental change. I want to ask, well, what happens if we turn this inside out? How does capitalism put nature to work, enfolding the consequences of capitalism through this? So it's not that I'm saying ignore the consequences. We need to pay attention to the hockey stick charts and what they mean. We have to get smarter about how we're doing that. And we need to look at the centrality of work, that capitalism works not because it does terrible things to nature, which we all know it does. Okay, but because it has been successful at mobilizing and appropriating manifold natures and putting these natures to work for free or low cost. This is central to capitalism's strategy of cheap nature, about which we'll get to in just a moment. We also want to turn Marxist thought inside out. So at its core, commodification is really central to a lot of Marxist thought about capitalism, and rightly so. But that can't be all. It's much too partial. This is the imaginary. This is sort of the imaginary of the Marxist commodity-centered, economy-centered model. So this is what we think when we imagine the growth of capitalism. Here, commodity circulation grows and grows and grows. This is the generalization of commodity production and exchange, something I can rattle off because that's what every Marxist says. But this forgets something important. It forgets the contributions, the unpaid contributions of unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies that we're going to get to in just a moment. It forgets the tripartite division of work and work energy, that is the physical capacities to perform work under capitalism. That only part of work is transformed into socially necessary labor time, the average labor time and the average commodity. It rests upon the pedestal of the unpaid work of human natures and extra-human natures, and that's crucial to the politics and the politics of the present, but the politics of modernity in general. That what I want to suggest is that capitalism is not so much a system of the generalization of commodity production and exchange, although that is a tendency. And remember, in a Marxist sense, the tendencies and counter-tendencies are part of the same process. That capitalism may be better thought of as islands of commodity production and exchange within oceans of potential cheap nature, of unpaid work energy. That is, oceans of cheap nature in the form of, in successive eras, African slaves, Baltic timber, American cotton and Mississippi cotton and American grain, all the rest, Persian Gulf oil, go on and on and on and on. So we have oceans of potential cheap nature that make possible these booming eras like the 30 glorious years after World War II, the booms of historical capitalism. So this gets us closer. How does capitalism expand and develop when it does expand and accumulate capital very rapidly? Well, we have the red being the cash nexus, the circuit of capital. The blue is the appropriated of unpaid or very cheap raw materials, labor, food, and energy, and then the green is the frontier. That, of course, gets progressively exhausted over historical time, and we're going to come back to that. All right, but let's not forget about 1492, because that's pretty important. So for the first time in nearly 200 million years, we had the reestablishment of a de facto Pangea. In fact, one of the forgotten things about the rise of capitalism, everyone wants to talk about the gold and the silver, the Orbis spike with the ecocidal and genocidal impact of old world diseases in the New World and all this, but there's a more important moment to that. That is the mobilization of the work of two new continents in service to capital accumulation from the very beginning. And and this included the movement of old world crops like sugarcane into the Americas. We'll come back to that. And it included centrally the movement of maize and potatoes into Europe, which incidentally came to the rescue of European agriculture right around 1700, just as proletarianization rapidly accelerated on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the fossil capital and Industrial Revolution arguments that we want to forget about these antecedents, both proletarianization within Europe, but also the conditions of that and how the origins of the modern proletariat are rooted in the racial formations of mass slavery, which was also, of course, a system of mass murder. So capitalism as a way of organizing cheap nature gives us a different set of questions through which to look at the history of capitalism, to look at the limits today, and to look at the politics around that. And so it gives us a way to go beyond what I would call the vampire model of green thought. Capitalism comes in, it sucks out the soil nutrients, the ore quality, the oil gets harder and harder to suck out, all of that. That's all important. So that's part of this model, but that can't be the end of it. We have to look at the relations that give rise to those processes, but also the relations that generate forms of nature that are increasingly hostile to capital accumulation. Here I think of a variety of processes within world agriculture, superweeds, etc., but also climate change, also processes of disease evolution and the coming end of antibiotic effectiveness, forms of nature that cannot be readily fixed through capitalist rationality. So what we're looking at is capitalism as a system of cheap nature. And that's not the whole story, but this gives us a way to cut into a bigger discussion and to evolve a bigger discussion about how capitalism is not separate from the web of life, but fundamental to the web of life, and that nature as a whole has also fundamentally shaped capitalism itself, that capitalism is both producer and product of nature as a whole. So capitalism's basic task is to transform the work energy of the biosphere into value, into this abstract social nature, the average labor time and the average commodity. Now, this is a very peculiar way of organizing life. And the great shift in the era of Columbus was from land productivity as the metric of wealth and power to labor productivity as a metric of wealth and power. That's important because it meant that the rest of nature could be put at the service of labor productivity. So if we think, for instance, of the colossal energy inefficiency of modern industrial agriculture, it takes 20 calories of food to put 1 calorie of food on the table. That only makes sense in a system where labor productivity is privileged and colossal energy inefficiency can be put at the service of labor productivity. Well, that has a very long history and indeed goes back to the history of Columbus himself, who was engaged in the origins of modern industrial agriculture in the sugar trade in the Madeiras in the 1480s, 70s, and 80s. So that valuation, this law or pattern of value, must radically exclude as well most human productive works. And so to say labor productivity is itself a statement of highly gendered and racialized exclusions. And that also means that radical exclusion, that definition of what counts as labor productivity, a violent abstraction, a real abstraction, cannot occur primarily by economic means, but rather through systems of abstract domination and oppression, not least the forms and patterns of racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence in the modern world. So cheap nature, what could this mean? Well, nature is never cheap. We know that. We've accepted that. But what do we mean by this? Well, first we have a moment of cheapening in price, driving down the necessary labor time. Remember that most labor time is not counted. Driving down the necessary labor time in the production of what I call the four cheaps: labor, food, energy, raw materials. These four big inputs, labor, food, energy, and raw materials, always have to be cheapened in price in their socially necessary labor time, their material volume augmented in order for great phases of capitalist development to occur. There's also to cheapen in a broadly cultural sense, that is to degrade and to render various forms of work less worthwhile, less dignified. This is the language of women's work, etc., expelling women, indigenous peoples, Africans, and others from society in the upper case made it easier to treat them as part of this external zone of nature and treat them accordingly. And to posit nature as external enabled that double cheapening of the lives and works, or triple cheapening of the lives and work of plants, of landscapes, of human and non-human animals. So we're back to this tripartite division. This has to be in our sense of how capitalism works. This is not simply a consequence of capitalism either, that this division of work in capitalism, in historical capitalism, also feeds back and shapes, it produces the conditions of capitalist development. So if not green arithmetic and its footprint in vampire models, what? Well, I'm not one of these guys who says Marx is right about everything. I'm one of these guys who says, is there a way of thinking that opens up different paths of interpretation and investigation to think about humans, human organizations, like capitalism, like empires, like stock exchanges, in the web of life? And so what Marx does is open up these very interesting questions in saying that modes of production affect a triple subject-object transformation of the relations between humans, of the relations between humans and the rest of nature, or external nature, Marx's phrase, and of the totality of relations of man and man and man and nature that are simultaneous, that are asymmetrical, that are interchangeable. And in this, the external is constitutive. The condition of some work being valued is that most work isn't, especially that of women, nature, and colonies, to quote Maria Mies. So every new era of capitalism throws up not only new imperialisms, but new gendered and racialized divisions of labor as central to its new ways of organizing nature, that is, the relations between humans and the rest of nature. So how do we get to the origins question? And of course, libraries full of books are filled with this question in one way or another. I want to suggest two interpenetrating frames. One is that the endless accumulation of capital is the endless transformation of the earth. So that accumulation, with its asymmetry of labor productivity and the appropriation of unpaid work energy, that is, over historical time, more and more material throughput attaches to the average quantum of socially necessary labor time, that if that is so, it will be revealed in the era's environmental history, in this era before the Industrial Revolution. And that modes of production, secondly, are simultaneously modes of reproduction and modes of thought. That is, accumulation with its disproportionate demand for unpaid work energy will tend to produce cultural forms, philosophies, knowledges that facilitate accumulation by appropriation, that is, produce cheap natures. So part of what we do in world ecology is we say, let's stop talking about the environment and look at environment-making activities, which include not only things like mining and building factories, but also new forms of knowledge, new cultural systems, and all the rest. That these are all environment-making activities. And what we see in this period between 1450 and 1750 is a wave of environment making that was unknown since the dawn of agriculture and the rise of the first cities. So these environment making revolutions are not just about technologies, there's that, but also about new ideas interwoven with those technologies and new forms and relations of power, including economic power as well as territorial power. Now, what we see even very early, even between 1450 and 1550, is that the key difference between feudalism and capitalism is in the scale, scope, and speed of environmental change. That what took centuries for feudal Europe to achieve occurred in mere decades in the long 16th century. This is my favorite factoid of this era, that in medieval Picardy, in northeastern France, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. 4 centuries later, in northeastern Brazil, it took 1 year to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. So this is an order of magnitude shift that we're seeing. And we need to take that seriously when we think of the origins of modernity and the origins of the crisis that we face today. So we look at the rise of capitalism as geographical but different in the old rise of the West arguments. That the geographical expansion of capitalism was about, in part, yes, the expansion of commodity production and exchange, but also the emergence of new techniques of power, technology, and science to appropriate unpaid work, and we'll get to this. That would include the new cartographic revolutions, the new ways of organizing botanical knowledge, and much beyond, mathematical revolutions, and so on and so forth. So what we are seeing in this era is not only the separation, really in a fundamental and epoch-making way for the first time, of humans and nature. Yes, Cicero talks about a second nature. The idea of a distinction between humans and the rest of nature was long-standing. But to organize a civilization on the basis of the separation of nature and society, which I'm going to get to in a moment, was also central, was also a moment of the separation of conception and execution in environment making. So to accumulate geographical, ecological, planetary knowledges of all kind in order to put the rest of nature to work, including many human beings who were put forcibly into the category of nature. This means to look at the history of capitalism as in part constituted, and an important constitutive moment, of capital, science, and nature as environment-making complexes. This goes from the era of the botanical gardens of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, to the Kew Gardens of the British in the 19th century, to the research centers of the Green Revolution, post-war U.S. order. So, we have the issue of science, but we also have an issue of culture. That is, that the emergence of nature, society, are powerful, real abstractions. That is, abstractions treated as real with real material force in the world. So a lot of times when people want to talk about this issue, they want to say, oh, well, this is a story of enclosures and of the peasants being kicked off the land. Well, yeah, that was hugely important, but it's also a story of most human beings under capitalism being expelled from humanity and being expelled from society. So when did this occur? Well, in the English language, and the story is slightly different for Portuguese and Spanish, but has a very interesting history of its own. But in the English language, nature and society assume their modern familiar meanings in this period 1550 to 1650. Well, what was happening in 1550 to 1650? Well, first, the defeat of Kett's Rebellion, the high tide of agrarian resistance to enclosures, and the capitalist transformation of the countryside in England. The onset of the English coal revolution. So if we want to talk fossil capitalism and fossil capital, let's start from 1530, not from 1730. The expulsion of England's agricultural population and their pushing them into non-agricultural and work and urban life, but also colonialism. So the third world begins not only in Hispaniola, but also in places like Ireland and Poland. So the intensification of English colonial rule, beginning in earnest in 1541, turned on the discourse of civility and savagery, that is, of society and nature. And indeed, in a letter that would echo and find different forms across the colonial experience, not only of the early modern era, but well into the era of the Vietnam War, and even more recently, we see the Earl of Northampton writing to Henry's advisor, urging colonial administrators in Ireland to draw the wild Irish that dwell in the woods and get them into English-style towns. This is a story that would be repeated again and again and again by the Dutch in Southeast Asia, by the Castilians in the Andes. Again and again and again, this would appear. But it wasn't only a story of colonialism. That was indeed central and pivotal. But it was also a question of a profound gender revolution. So the separation of nature and society was also a separation of man, woman, and the redefinition of womanhood and the membership of women in humanity, in society. So that nature, society, man, woman, black, white, indigenous, European, all became central to the new class relations of the era. And just as most work no longer counted as work, women's work, outside the cash nexus, but still necessary to it, so too most humans didn't count as, well, humans with the uppercase H. So for those of you who know a little bit of this economic history of the 16th and 17th century, you know this is an era of what's called the price revolution. So prices skyrocketed, not only but significantly because of first European silver and then American silver and gold. But lo and behold, wages didn't increase as fast. No surprise there. But what often gets left out of this picture is that there was not only a price-wages gap, but also a powerfully gendered price-wages gap, so that women, that the creation of these binaries of this man, woman, black, white, Europe and the rest, nature, society, were powerfully implicated in capital accumulation. So that the rise of capitalism was about the emergence of a new cultural formation, an economic formation, geographical formations in which each was implied in the other. So that by 1700, as Federici explains, the definition of women as non-workers was largely complete. The most spectacular instance of this long process was the witch trials, witch hunts that occurred across Europe and into North America. But there's much more to it. That was the tip of the iceberg. So what we're seeing is a process through which the expulsion of humans from humanity, from society, performed a crucial task in the emergence of capitalism, in the accumulation of capital. That is, the pedestal of wage labor, of surplus value, is the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. So Orlando Patterson, the historical sociologist, famously characterizes modern slavery in these terms as social death. And though he doesn't fully grasp the implications of this, what this meant was that Africans were effectively treated as part of nature and not society, so that they could be treated cheaply. But this also goes on with gender. And Nestor King evocatively describes this new gendered order as one of human sacrifice, that is, dispossessing women of culture, put into the domain of nature, which was law-like but unthinking. And this was part of an overall Cartesian revolution that I'll get to in just a moment. But this metaphor was not merely a metaphor, the metaphor of human sacrifice, that of nearly 250,000 Africans shipped to northeastern Brazil at the height of the sugar boom, the population in 1650 was just 60,000. Of 2.2 million slave departures over these 2 centuries, just 300,000 African slaves in the Americas by 1700. So not simply unpaid work, of course, but this is huge, that the capitalocene is also, in Justin McBrien's phrase, a necrocene. It is also an apparatus of mass killing. So now we get to poor Descartes. And I'm going to pick on Descartes, but of course he wasn't alone. That the Cartesian revolution, a revolution of thought, did 3 big things in this era. Privileged substances over relations, privileged either-or reasoning over both-and favored the purposive control of nature by applied science. Or, in Descartes' words, humans must make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. So if that sounds like the ethos of the slaveholder, it is. And indeed, if you read Descartes and you read Francis Bacon, that's the second quote here, the womb of nature, the empire of man. This was a view of nature that was unquestionably useful in many respects, but was also the view of the conqueror, of the slaveholder, of the patriarch. So, the project of early modern scientific revolutions was, as I mentioned before, to make nature external, to make spaces flat, to make time as linear. No one's arguing that these weren't useful. These were tremendously useful. But what we want to understand is that Cartesian dualism wasn't just an analytic. It was also a real abstraction. So Cartesian dualism was also a Cartesian logic after the brutal conqueror of Mexico. And this leads us to the question of, well, what was actually happening on the landscapes of early modern Europe, of the Americas, of elsewhere on the planet that capitalism touched? Well, not a lot that was good if you didn't happen to be somebody like Cortez. So, capitalism doesn't just have frontiers. It is fundamentally a frontier system in a way that no other civilization was. That it is a system in which the geographical moment of endless economic expansion is the endless conquest of the earth, which is obviously impossible. So the fantasy ultimately confronts real limits, but it's not so simple as confronting running into a wall. It's something a little stickier, maybe more like quicksand at a certain point than anything else. So what we see in this era was the creation of a global Baltic and a global Atlantic, of enclosures, of course, de facto and de jure in colonial and northwestern, in colonial zones in northwestern Europe, driving the combined and uneven development of agricultural revolutions, which produce more and more food with less and less labor, the radical extensions and expansions of monetary and credit relations from Peru to Poland, and as we've noted, the violent politico-cultural redefinition of indigenous peoples, Africans and women, as nature with the uppercase N. So frontiers require something external. They are zones of uncapitalized nature, but they're also actively produced. They're not, Engels used this term, the free gift of nature, which is sometimes attributed to Marx. It's not Marx's term, but that's wrong because it was neither free, there was work involved, but it wasn't a gift either, because these gifts of nature, so-called, that the Europeans discovered in the New World were not gifted. See if I can avoid spilling my water. Were not gifted, and were actively produced by indigenous peoples in the New World for millennia. The idea of pristine nature is a fundamentally colonial construct because it erases the active historical geographical activities of indigenous peoples in the New World for millennia. So until we come to grips with some of the deeper histories and the deeper erasures in our world history, we are going to be hobbled in dealing with climate change and in the politics of climate justice. So in addition to a great frontier, we also had commodity frontiers. And commodity frontiers were very unusual in the sense that I talked about with this contrast between feudal Europe and early modern Europe and deforestation, so that in northeastern France it took 2 centuries to clear these 12,000 hectares. In northeastern Brazil it could be done in 1 year. Well, commodity frontiers, and you can look at all the different kinds of frontiers that were used, and there were many other frontiers for early modern Europe as well. But really the unusual characteristic of these frontiers, well, there were several, but one of the unusual characteristics was that they moved so fast. They moved extraordinarily fast. They didn't move by centuries. They moved by decades. And you can see this with Madeira, São Tomé, Pernambuco, Bahia, Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, and then it goes to Cuba. It is this churning acceleration of the relations of landscapes and power and capital that get taken up very, very early on, that this thing that David Harvey once called time-space compression, that everything gets accelerated. This isn't an invention of the 19th century with the telegraph and the steam engine. This is an invention of the age of Columbus. So, and crucially, what gets dropped out of these stories, the environmental historians are very good about this, but I think the ways that the work of environmental historians has been taken up is that the zone of labor, the zone of work gets dropped out. And one of the things that I've been wanting to emphasize, not just in a particular example, this is the history, every time the sugar frontier moved, so every time these frontiers moved, the slaving zones in Africa moved. And that's important for a reason that goes well beyond the history of sugar in the 17th century, which maybe a lot of you don't really care about. But that new industrial revolutions, new cash crop revolutions, new agricultural revolutions always involve massive movements of human beings across the planet in the history of capitalism. And that peasantries, historically, which don't really exist in their classic form anymore, in their 19th century form anymore, the peasantries too, or zones of people reproducing their lives outside of the cash nexus, beyond capitalism, the peasantries too have been part of this frontier process. So we need to put together these processes of work and environmental change. And indeed, this helps us counter the neo-Malthusian argument about population, that the rise of capitalism inverts the age-old dynamic of population. That always before capitalism, population grew, people moved out, settled in new zones, commerce followed. Well, capitalism turns that inside out in a radical way. That European expansion doesn't happen because of some great demographic boom. Indeed, what happens is that now people are following the commodities, not the other way around. And that's an audacious movement. And of course, by following the commodities, many of them, in the case of the slave trade, were kidnapped. This gives you a sense, these are all very stylized, but this is what I call the social death surplus profit. This is from Orlando Patterson's characterization of modern slavery, that this is the slave trade and the volume of the slave trade, the annual volume of the slave trade relative to the annual growth of GDP. So this gives you just one more representation of how this kind of work, a kind of unpaid work, was central to modern economic growth. Remember, islands of commodity production and exchange in oceans of unpaid work. So what was going on in this era? Well, one was the agricultural revolutions of northwestern Europe, producing more and more food with less and less labor power. This didn't begin in England. Even Robert Brenner doesn't believe so anymore. It begins in the Low Countries for all sorts of interesting reasons. But what you see is that you had wheat yields, this is for England, dramatically increase, And by the time you get to the era of the Industrial Revolution into the 18th century, you see a kind of agricultural crisis, which isn't reflected in here. Wheat yields go up because all this land was taken out of cultivation and given to sheep. Sheep were eating men, not only in England, but across the Americas, across the early modern era. That this wasn't just a story of enclosures and class struggle and agronomy in a stylized way. This also had to do with surveying, with cartographic revolutions. And this is, of course, the place, England, in the 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries, when you see the origins of the modern survey. There's no capitalism without surveys like this, and we can remember that most of the so-called founding fathers of America were, many of them, not most of them, but many of them, like George Washington, were surveyors. It's not an accident. That there was also a powerful moment in this era between 1450 and 1550 of the European silver and iron and copper revolution, that it's doubtful that capitalism could have got going without this. Famously, Agricola observes in this era, the woods and groves are cut down, for there's need of an endless amount of wood for timbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Talks about all the terrible things that were happening, and then he says, in a very modern turn of phrase, well, it doesn't matter because we all got rich and we can just buy all the stuff that we lost. So there's a very, very old sense of the capitalist market will come and save us even from this era of the mid-16th century. There were the origins of industrial agriculture, which I intimated earlier, begin in Madeira, then Sao Tome in the 1450s, and then again in the 1540s in Sao Tome, followed quickly by Brazil's rise to the commanding heights of the world sugar economy. Meanwhile, we have this ongoing movement of the slaving frontier in Africa, this churning labor frontier there. In Southeast Asia, we see the combination of the Dutch removing not just the clove trees, the nutmeg and mace bushes, but also reorganizing indigenous populations. The Dutch were spectacularly brutal. Even Adam Smith, who of course hated the Dutch because he was English, but Adam Smith says, oh, the Dutch were just awful. They were horrible. But there's a lot of truth to that. In the case of the Andes, we don't normally talk about this. It's strange to me that we don't talk about what happened in the Andes as something just as important as what happens in England. I guess Eurocentrism and Anglocentrism die hard. But what happened in the Andes was spectacular. By the end of the 1560s, Peru's Potosi, the great silver mountain which dwarfed by 8-1 all the other silver producing centers in the Americas, its silver production had totally collapsed. It coincided with a massive fiscal crisis in Spain because Philip II was trying to fight two wars at once, and they reorganize. They go about this imperial-led restructuring of the Andes. 1.5 million people, that was the population of Portugal at the time. So this was huge. The empire reorganizes 1.5 million people into Spanish-style towns in order to provide labor for the mines and for other economic sectors necessary to sustain the mines. It was gigantic. By the way, indigenous peoples, they were naturales. They were part of nature. And yes, naturales had different meanings at the time as well, and we can get into the complexities of this, but it's very clear these were not members of society. They were part of nature, and there were ongoing boundary struggles around that question, especially in law. But what happened in this era was this reorganization of this vast region in order to supply labor for the mines, but not only human wage work, but also the work of wives and families. So about 13,000 forced wage workers on the roads to Potosi every year, but then 50 to 60,000 total. Plus unpaid animal work, the llamas for Potosi, the llamas for all sorts of other activities, and this combined with massive deforestation, so that the Andes, which had never had many trees, were absolutely stripped bare. And you can look at the contemporary accounts of this again and again and again, but it worked. Cheap nature was restored, more and more silver was put out, and with less and less labor power, it was an incredible ecological revolution. So one episode after another in this era, you can by looking at these, you can begin to see the audacious and rapid-fire character of environment making, the draining of fens and wetlands across Europe, which of course was never just like, oh, let's drain the wetland. It was a form of enclosure because wetlands were commons for peasants who lived in these areas. There was the ongoing exhaustion of the Mediterranean forests, which had never been particularly thick, but that was part of a double movement. One was that the Iberian powers, but especially Spain, began to build their fleet in Havana, in Cuba, but also elsewhere in the Caribbean. But then you also have the recentering of shipbuilding, which was like the auto sector of its time, of the 20th century. You know, it's a fundamental basic industry. The recentering of shipbuilding to the north, where the Dutch and the English could get cheap timber from, well, places like Poland and Lithuania and Norway and into Finland and all the rest of it. That you also have the story of the Dutch, even though you see, every agricultural revolution has its colonial moment. So when we think about England and enclosures, we often forget that England was dependent on a lot of other activities, including this creation of a colonial Baltic zone in order to make its power work. And so the Dutch fed themselves off cheap Polish grain. Once Polish agriculture crashed right around 1700, England takes over, but only for a very short period. It's almost never talked about, but English agriculture becomes the breadbasket for Northern Europe for 50 years. And then right around 1760, it absolutely collapses. And it had a lot to do with soil fertility, but also the reluctance of English farmers to engage in best practices of the era because it would have cost too much. It would have taken too much labor. So you have these stories of metallurgy, mining, moving across, into new frontiers again and again and again. Sweden, Russia, North America. Ireland is completely deforested. It goes from 12% forest cover in 1600 to about 2% in 1700. It's incredible. And, oh yes, if we want to talk about energy, let's remember the English coal doesn't begin, the coal revolution doesn't begin in 1700, it begins in the 16th century. So what we're looking at here is a series of massive environment-making shifts that were going on in this era that we have. Again, let me remind you, the reestablishment of Pangaea. I think that cannot be underemphasized, and hardly anyone outside of Crosby, who doesn't really know anything about political economy anyway, unfortunately, talks about that the reestablishment of Pangaea was absolutely central to the rise of capitalism, and indeed sets the stage for the Industrial Revolution in all sorts of interesting ways. So this was a way of putting land and labor together in new dynamic combinations that were quite destructive of the local environments, but also exhausted the labor power, the human lives that were doing the work. And there are many examples we could provide, but we can just look at a series of labor productivity revolutions that were quite powerful. The printing press, successive sugar mills, which always, every time sugar frontiers moved, there was technological innovation. We often think of merchant capitalism as somehow technologically inert, which it wasn't. And indeed, I'm not sure we should call it merchant capitalism. That every time metal mining and metallurgical frontiers moved, not just in the Americas with silver amalgamation, but also in Europe, there were new technological improvements. You also see the emergence of new forms of shipbuilding powered by water-powered sawmills, so replace the skilled workers, the sawyers, and start to build ships like the Dutch Vloot, the great ship, sort of the Model T of early modern ships. That you could build these ships with standardized parts and replace costly skilled labor. All of these things were going on that were suggestive of a much more powerful transformation than what we had seen in earlier eras, and that we usually don't give this era credit for these things, and they were all based on new weaves and webs of relationships with extra-human nature. So the Dutch Vloot ship, this Model T of early modern ships, only came about after cheap timber from southern Norway came flowing into the shipbuilding centers like Leiden. So we want to put together the big epistemological and ontological and philosophical revolutions of early modern Europe with a revolution in commodity production and exchange with its environmental history. So how do we put all of this together? That's really quite crucial, and I think that we're only at the beginning of putting these things together. I think once we do, the history is important because it shapes how we understand the crisis today. So what I would emphasize here as we wrap up in the last 15 minutes or so, 10 minutes or less actually, new ideas that we want to put together: the organization of world money, the organization of world power, and the organization of world nature. I think that these have to be put together. So if we want a critical IR theory, we need to be able to put together world money, world power, and world nature, and to see the role of the European rationality of world domination in all of this. This is a great phrase from Max Weber. So we see the emergence of world money for the first time with the Amsterdam Bourse, the Amsterdam and other banking institutions in the very beginning of the 17th century, and we see that a growing number of commodities, 360 different commodities, are traded on the Amsterdam Bourse by 1639. This rises across the 17th and 18th centuries, and this is really a way of organizing world nature. It's not the only way, but it's a very, very crucial way of organizing nature. So when I say Wall Street is a way of organizing nature, we need to take that seriously, and it has a very long history. Hedge funds are a way of organizing nature. Derivatives are a way of organizing nature. And by that I mean the relations between humans and the rest of nature. So we need to begin to put these together to see how the conception, the separation of conception and execution that was there at the beginning gets deepened successively over the history of capitalism, all the way to where we have genomic mapping and debates over biotech and intellectual property and all the rest of it. So these shifts of seeing global space are important. Here is what's called a TO map. There's not much you can do with this from our perspective, but this was a map that was very useful and widely circulated in the era of the Crusades. This is the Mercator projection that we're all familiar with. This is the map that you can go and conquer and rule and subordinate and appropriate the work of the planet with. This is a very useful projection. It's not very useful if you want to know how big Greenland is relative to Mexico, but it's very useful if you want to navigate the planet and to treat it as a warehouse of cheap resources. So that's a way of understanding how these shifts are very intimately related. Oh, by the way, Mercator lived in the Dutch Republic, the model capitalist nation of the 17th century. So we're going to wrap up here. I'm going to give you a few comments, a few thoughts about how we can think about the present moment. So I'm going to give you a very stylized contrast here. So we're going to say this is the before moment. This is capitalism at the very beginning, where the opportunities for continued expansion, this green circle, is the zone of potential cheap nature that's not yet taken up. This is the history. This is neoliberalism today. That is, neoliberalism is an era of capitalism, not as neoliberalization. But what privatizations and the extension of commodity relations have done is to not only suck up the potential cheap nature, but also undermine the capacity for successful capital accumulation in terms of real investment by capitalizing more and more of life. Because what's not normally taken seriously in political economy is that great booms, think of the steam engine or the internal combustion engine, occur because vast amounts of cheap, extremely low-cost energy were available to push this technological advance forward and to open up all the other investment opportunities that went with it. And it doesn't have to be an energy argument strictly. It can be a mass slavery argument, that the slave trade opened up extraordinary opportunities for surplus capital to invest in shipping, in shipbuilding, in manufacture, and all the rest in these eras. So the condition for great booms is indeed this big, thick blue and green zone. So we have seen this era, this great problem since the 1970s, that tendentially what we have is a very significantly contracting frontier zone of potentially cheap nature. Now as we know, neoliberalism dealt with this, and I'm going to touch on how that happened just very, very briefly, and we can get into it more in the conversation. But we see a decline of the world ecological surplus, that is the ratio of the total capital to the in play to the appropriated work energy, the unpaid work energy in play. So that means that there's been a relatively rising volume of surplus capital and a relatively contracting volume of unpaid work energy. This explains in part why we have all these piles of money on the tables of the global casino, that we have all this financialized capital that can't find enough profitable opportunities to go into the production of building the 21st century's version of the flute ship or the steam engine or the internal combustion engine. And no, it's not high tech. That has not come to the rescue. So this problem was partly resolved. This problem of the declining world ecological surplus was partly resolved, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there's this other moment, what I call the rise of negative value. And I mentioned earlier that what we see in this era is not only the piling up of quantitative forms of waste and pollution and all the rest of it. We see that. So the great garbage patch in the middle of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That could probably be cleaned up reasonably quickly and readily if there was interest to do so. But what we're seeing are forms of nature like climate change, like superweeds in industrial agriculture, like superbugs and new disease vectors that cannot be treated, cannot be contained, cannot be disciplined so readily by the forms of capitalist rationality and the tools at its disposal. And so this is what I would call the rise of negative value. I think it also includes forms of social movements like food sovereignty that make ontological demands that can't be satisfied within capitalism that are now coming to the fore. So what happened in the neoliberal era? Well, we saw the four cheaps restored. We saw commodity prices for metals fall, for food, oil stabilizes, and of course labor costs were dramatically rolled back across not only the global north but the global south. Labor's share of national incomes across the world falls dramatically. And what I want to stress here is that cheap nature and the restoration of cheap nature includes the questions of labor. So we need to put these questions at the heart of our discussions of environmental sustainability, I think. And we need to put the wage repression in the global north especially into that. We need to deal with the creation of how the global factory was linked to the great global enclosure of the era and the great doubling of the world's workforce after 1989. But not just that, we have to pay attention to how the great doubling was, again, an even greater expansion of the female proletariat, adding paid work on top of unpaid work. So this was the globalization of the second shift. And so remember that prices-wages gap from early modern capitalism that was highly gendered. Well, this was the most recent, maybe the last, we can't say, the most recent wave of this gendered surplus. What I would say is that these are all one-shot deals and that capitalism cannot infinitely fix its own problems, that it depends on the frontier as a way of dealing with its problems. But of course, since 2003, and with some interesting developments since 2014, we've seen all the four cheaps become more expensive. Yes, energy and oil prices are temporarily cheaper, but that has much to do with with another cheap, the emergence of cheap money, of historically low interest rates, while the production costs continue to go up and up and up. Indeed, the cost of bringing in a new the cost of bringing a new barrel of oil into production over the past decade has gone up by an order of magnitude. So you're seeing fundamental shifts in all this, and of course, with labor, you see in the workshop of the world, real wages in China, labor unrest in China. Everything is going up and up and up. Yes, runaway factories can run, but they run to places like Cambodia, which are much, much smaller. Metals are, again, subject to the same dynamic, very historically high prices, even though it's come off their peaks. And food is probably the most significant of all of these. We have seen since 1995, and I write quite a bit about this in my book and elsewhere, we've seen biotech as a kind of attempted agricultural revolution. So historically, agricultural revolutions have done something very simple in the modern world. They produce more and more food with less and less labor time. That has not been happening in the era of biotech. Biotech has not reversed the ongoing slowdown of agricultural productivity in the heartlands of industrial agriculture, and indeed now seems to be wrapped up with rising costs of production and rising toxification and rising problems of negative value, both in terms of super weeds, but also in terms of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty makes a simple demand that's very outrageous to how capitalism has worked, that says the right to food, the right to culture, and the right to democracy are inseparable from each other. So it's very much what I would call a world ecological revolution. And of course, climate change really does change everything. And with agriculture, it fundamentally suppresses the yield of the big four cereal crops of soy, maize, rice, and wheat. So no cheap food, no modernity. All right, so to wrap up, we need to think about how work and value fits into all of this. If you're like me, I never liked this term, this turgid Marxist phrase, the law of value. But it's very quaint, it's a very Hegelian 19th century kind of way of talking about things. But really what we're talking about is a pattern of the hierarchy of value, of what gets valued and what doesn't. So as we've seen, modernity is very much premised on labor productivity as the key decisive metric of wealth. And that puts everything else, that involves a whole series of racialized and gendered and class exclusions and hierarchies and all the rest of it. So I want to talk about why that matters to our politics. So first of all, history matters. We can't deal with this problem. We can't resolve this problem by theoretical fiat. That's not going to work. And I'm saying this especially to my colleagues in the social sciences and humanities outside of history. We need a radically historical interpretation of what's going on, and that we need to understand that how we periodize world history affects our politics. And it affects what we're going to explain and how we're going to explain it. So if we start with the Industrial Revolution, we're going to end up with a very different set of politics, a very different set of interpretations than if we begin in the era of Columbus. So what I would say is that we need to look at how work and the relations of power, knowledge, capital, and nature began to transform and shift in some epochal ways in this early modern era, and of course have been significantly and importantly remade ever since. But what I want to highlight here is something that's often quoted from Marx, that labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much a source. And what often gets lopped off of this is that labor itself is a force of nature. And that's quite important, because we need to understand work as fundamental to environmental change. And I think that gets us out of the red-green fundamentalism that we need to save nature. No, we need social justice. We need to have a way of putting these two together that does more than just pushes them together. We need a synthesis, because otherwise we end up in an old position, and we've seen a replay of this very sadly, I think, around the North Dakota Access Pipeline of jobs versus environment, with some elements of the labor movement going in one direction and others pointing towards a new synthesis. But Marx is useful because he allows us to go beyond labor and nature to thinking labor in nature, nature in labor, and to understanding the manifold forms of work that are organized, work performed not just by wage workers, but also by all humans, also by all nature in the process of making the modern world. It allows us to start to come to terms with this tripartite division of labor. Paid work, the unpaid work of human natures, the unpaid work of extra-human natures. So, what are the implications of this? They are, I think, that emancipatory politics has to stop drawing lines around whose work and whose lives matter and whose does not. That the worker is not only waged but unwaged, not only human but extra-human. The specification of capitalism's contradictions, weaknesses, and limits have to flow through this unity and diversity. I would say no politics of work without nature and no politics of nature without work, and that a historical and relational and post-Cartesian thinking can help us to see whose lives and whose work is strategically located within capitalism's world ecological contradictions at any point in time, because we still needed an analysis of how the system works. And finally, that the questions of the politics of life and work can no longer be enclosed within society. To quote Thomas Munzer, who was at the center of the first great peasant and worker revolt of this wave of Central European mining and metallurgical capitalism, the creatures too must become free. Thank you.
So, Jason, let's throw another variable in here. Not that there aren't a million variables, but where does, Brad, I kept wondering, where does the state fit?
Yeah.
So let me just, I won't try to get on that. What do you think?
Well, first of all, what is the state? But I think because my experience comes out of sociology, where historical sociologists love to talk about which states, England and France, right? They don't really want to talk about Portugal. You know, even Perry Anderson in this great historical sociology of early modern absolutism wants to talk about everyone, wants to talk about the Swedes, but not about the Portuguese. I think we need to understand that the state was, in the rise of capitalism, in some fundamental ways, not just the state, but the geopolitical system that was emerging was fundamental to the whole process in several major ways. One is in the surveying and cartographic revolutions in all their different forms, and guaranteeing both culturally and juridically forms of property. So this isn't just an English story, which everyone wants to talk about, but also a Portuguese story. Please excuse me, I can read Portuguese, but everything I say in Portuguese sounds French. So the Sesmaria, a form of property relation that emerges in Portugal towards the end of the 14th century, is in fact quite amenable to the alienation of property and the emergence of a market in land that, of course, is one of the central conditions of capitalist development. That emerges under the protection of the state, through the state. It's legislative. It's carried into Madeira, into Sao Tome, into Brazil. That's important. Of course, in terms of the geopolitical system, I think the older Weberian argument about the military revolution and how important that was to transforming tax revenues into capital can't be overemphasized. I mean, the degree. I mean, I know you're an early modernist, so I'm preaching to the choir here. But that transformation, that military revolution, was funded by credit. And was a means of turning the revenues of not just domestic states, but also of Potosi into capital. So the state was central there. And the interstate system, the geopolitics, was central because, of course, the states were, that period of especially, 1490s to certainly into the late 17th century was just this period of extraordinary, ongoing, ceaseless warfare, and it all required money and more, orders of magnitude more money over this period. And of course, states aren't very good at, capitalists aren't very good at a lot of things. They're not very good at reorganizing populations or things like that, which were, that was the whole colonial system, the achievement of, everyone wants to say, the Spanish Empire wasn't that great or wasn't that strong or whatever, but the reorganizations of land and labor that occurred across the Americas have to rank as an accomplishment every bit as great as that of the steam engine, probably more. So, hugely important.
I was going to just riff on my question about biopolitics, and actually, and we need to dial back to the 1380s.
Mm-hmm.
When small city states start to form, start to play. And I just wonder whether in fact there is lurking behind us a recovery from the Black Death, which is a combination of these, merchant capital circles operating in penetration with state formations, are kind of setting the stage for European expansion. This European internal demographic expansion is going to provide a context for this commercial explosion that you're talking about, the capital explosion. So I just,
Yeah. No, I think there's probably something to that. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, John. I guess you and then Alex, and why don't we take the two questions one after the other?
Sure. I like the presentation, but it was unclear to me throughout either what the concept of work was or the concept of capital and its difference between pre-capitalist and other productions. For example, your tripartite scheme about exploitation of unpaid work with nature, but why isn't in the Indus Valley civilization, digging a ditch, creating an irrigation system, exploitation of the unpaid, like, human natures, right? It seems like your concept of work kind of emphasizes labor in general, metabolic relations to human, but not the peculiarity of capitalist labor, which is modification of labor. It's the extension of exchange into the immediate process of production. And then this I guess gets to the concept of capital, which is, I'm not clear. You started with Brodel in terms of, I guess, the non-market and then commodification, but I mean, what is it? Like, I'm not sure why this wouldn't be just as true before capitalism as capitalism. I'm not sure what's distinct about capitalism.
And what, Alex?
I guess I had a comment and then a question. The comment to go back to the previous question about the state. It seems to me that nobody would deny the hugely important role of the state historically in the process you're describing. But from the standpoint of theory construction, the question is, can you derive that role from some larger theory, let's call it a Marxist theory? And I remember the debates in the 80s, one logic or two, and the world systems people were divided about this. Can you derive the logic of the state system from the logic of capital or not? And my sense is that you can't. That was the conclusion of that debate. And I'm not confident that you'll be able to derive the role of the state from your analysis either, but I guess that would be a question. We can talk about that at dinner. That's more of a comment than a question. The question I wanted to pose is that you make it seem as if capitalism is really bad, or is all bad, and undoubtedly it's bad in lots of different ways, but some of the things that one is looking to, that you're looking to for politically progressive movements today, require a capitalist world, a liberal world, a world where people have human rights, they have the right to speak freely, they have the right to organize, all that kind of stuff. So your talk emphasizes, well, the exclusion of humans from humanity. But if you look at the 21st century, we're seeing more and more people in humanity being included in all of humanity. Responsibility to protect, all this kind of stuff at the global level to protect individuals. And that's all liberalism. That's kind of the positive side of all this. So I guess I'm wondering, does the positive side of capitalism have any role to play? Or is this really a very negative picture, and whatever progressive politics we can get have got to come from somewhere else?
Well, fantastic questions both. Let me see if I can answer relatively succinctly. To the question of one logic or two, I'm uncomfortable talking about logics. I prefer to talk about patterns. And clearly territorial powers, states and empires, etc., work historically in very different ways than capital does. And they have very different sets of rewards and incentives. So if that means logic, then I would say definitely two logics. Human rights and liberalism, yes and no. I mean, I don't want, is capitalism uniformly bad? No, of course not. I mean, I'm with Marx that it's dialectical. The genocidal, ecocidal tendencies of capitalism, which are now at the fore, I would say, and are primary. I think that is the lesson of the sixth extinction and climate change, amongst other processes. But there are clearly countervailing processes and tendencies that are part of that. In a sense, I would say yes, liberalism. But also, I mean, liberalism historically was very successful in keeping a lot of people from human rights and civil rights. And capitalism today is very successful at keeping a significant chunk of humanity. Mike Davis calls them surplus humanity, people for whom there's no real prospect of integration into the system of formal employment. That's 1 to 2 billion easily. So that's a fairly massive exclusion, and that would be, for me, the lowest bar of exclusion. But yes, clearly there are elements of universalism that I think we get from liberalism that socialists have embraced, often problematically. But yeah, that can't be just dismissed. All right, so I think that's central. The Indus Valley civilization didn't go and conquer the world. So that's the first part of my answer. The peculiarity of work under capitalism is not about wage labor. Indeed, in 13th century England, about 1/3 of the working population depended on wage labor to reproduce its livelihood. So we need to look at different combined and uneven systems of reproducing life and work and how those fit together. So Marx is absolutely right when he writes that the pedestal of wage labor in the era of large-scale industry is mass slavery. And that wasn't a throwaway comment. That was absolutely fundamental. I got you in 2 seconds. And indeed, we have seen a resurgence of explanations even from the left that say, well, it's all about fossil capital. Well, there's no fossil capital. There's no coal revolution in the way that we understand the textile-driven industrial revolution without the largely unpaid work of slaves and the unpaid work of the soils of the Mississippi Delta. So what's different about capitalism as a system of endless accumulation, of MCM prime, of probably all the things that we would agree on? I don't think those can be theoretically imposed on history. I think that there is a process of endless capital accumulation premised on what Marx calls abstract social labor, that there is a logic of socially necessary labor time. The mistake of Marxists has been to see that the value form, the commodity, and the relations necessary to make a system of commodification are identical. And they are emphatically not identical. In other words, the value form, the commodity, depends both on wage labor, but on a much larger, simultaneously, a much larger system of appropriating the free or low-cost work and energy of women, nature, and colonies. And that allows us to bring in a series, that insight allows us to bring in to the core of a largely economistic discussion, questions of imperialism, of race, of gender, and science and nature that are important. So I don't pretend that I have the answer, but I think that we have to have a non-economistic theory of capitalism because I think life is non-economistic and history is non-economistic. But that doesn't deny the kind of centrality of a certain kind of economic process of Marx's MCM prime. There is a certain sense in which modern world history does reward and punish actors on that basis. Yeah?
Well, pardon me. I'm just a pedestrian who wanders.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. So, but it seems to me, building off the last question, that you seem rather critical of modernity. What strikes me is odd, given that you're speaking into a tiny little microphone, looking at a real thin computer screen, which is broadcasting everything so we can all see it too. And that's largely a result of the technological boom from the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, which undoubtedly, indisputably, raised living standards of billions of people across the world. And that goes, it seems, counter to your zero-sum game almost equation about the, what do you call it, the red and the green spheres. And you mentioned that there's been I think a 600% increase in the wages of Chinese or some large increase in the wages of Chinese.
Oh, yes, there are rising real wages in China, that's true.
It seems to me that's a good thing, and that people are living longer, having better living standards, and not walking barefoot behind oxen, but doing other work that's rewarding and tasting well so they and their families can live better. So it seems to me almost that
that maybe you complain too much and that maybe some of your arguments are somewhat obsolete. But I will say one other thing. In response to your last question, you mentioned the genocidal tendencies of capitalism. And to me, when I look back on the 20th century, certainly, I see genealogical tendencies of Marxism just everywhere. So I'd like you to comment on those things.
All right, do we have some other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed your essays over the years.
Oh, thank you.
I had a question about where you place cities in all of this. You talk about cities at various points, what we'll see and such. And I wonder to what extent their integration of the ecological comes, how the urban fits in it, and how urban centers obviously is organizing centers, mobilization of the capital, fit into this model, since you don't want to separate the urban from this nature that you speak of. I was wondering if you could just comment on it, because I actually don't know where you stand.
Thanks. That's a beautiful question. And thanks, sir, for your question. I don't think that you and I are ever going to come to agreement on even the basic facts of the matter.
Well, maybe we can find some areas of comment.
Well, let me just, because I want to answer both of these questions. Let me put it this way, that if you look at what even the International Energy Agency, which is hardly a hotbed of radical thought, says, this is the OECD's think tank for energy policy, even their assessment is that if present trends continue, we're at 4 degrees Celsius increase. Let me tell you, there's a lot of life that's going to perish through that process. So it's an important discussion. Maybe afterwards we can go back and forth a little bit more. For the question about urbanization, yes, absolutely, and I'm so pleased that you brought this up. That is really where I started and what has shaped my thinking all the way through, that there is this relation of town and country that's very specific in the modern world. My friend Neil Brenner brilliantly narrates this as planetary urbanization, not in the simple sense that half of the world's population now lives in cities, but that the physical infrastructures and relations of capital now encompass the world in very, very powerful and contradictory and dynamic ways. So, yes, we need, I'll tell you what we need. We need a history of urbanization in the history of the modern world. We have lots of histories of cities, but we don't have a good sense of a history of planetary urbanization, and we don't even have a lot of studies that look like Cronin's brilliant Nature's Metropolis, right? We don't. When that was published, I thought, God, we're going to have stories of Nature's Metropolis for Hong Kong and for London and Paris, and where are they? I mean, there are some. But I think that antagonism of town and country has to be put at the center, in my view. And in my view, that's one of the crucial geographical expressions or moments of how capitalism works in the world. So I think it's hugely important.
Okay, I think we probably should wrap it up, but Jason might be happy to chat for a few minutes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so.
Thank you. Thank you.